Namaskar, good evening, and a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Pune International Center. The chief driving force behind PIC and a tireless inspirator for all of us to talk about the PIC and to give us his welcome speech.
They say in a 1,000-mile journey, there is always the first step. And that first step was taken by us exactly a year ago when Pune International Center was launched on 24 September by none other than our beloved Anna, that is Sri Mohan Dharia. And I must say that we did it in style with the inaugural lecture by a national thought leader, who, by the way, just does not believe in thought, but also action, Nandan Nilekani. And how quickly the year has passed. Pratap Rao and I were just talking about this. It looks like yesterday that the launch of PIC took place. And as they say, all good things have to be repeated. So we are repeating what we did a year ago, yet another thought leader of the same height, same status, same eminence as Nandan Nilekani is giving the keynote address on our first anniversary. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta.
Now, when Dilip Padgaonkar suggested the topic for this evening, statecraft and governance, I was sort of tempted to say, well, this is either a very long speech or a very short one. The very short one goes, governance doesn't exist and the state is very crafty. The long one, being academics sort of who study this thing, would actually take quite a while, because I think we are at a particular juncture in the evolution of our governance, which cannot be grasped through conventional categories of political analysis and politics. And I think we are all struggling in some ways to actually find what the right vocabulary is, in a sense, what those right principles are. In a way, I think in relation to governance, we are conceptually probably the same way we were in relation to our economy in the late 80s and late 90s. As Dr. Kelkar always used to remind us, once you globalize, you can't run an open economy with the principles of a closed economy. So what I plan to do in the next 25-30 minutes, I will try not to keep you longer than that, is really try and paint a big picture story about where I think we are in this governance debate. What is it that we need to think about when we are now designing new architectures of governance? Because if we don't adhere to these principles in thinking about what this new architecture should be, or what our political response should be, we will keep slipping back to, as it were, old modes and old mistakes. Now, before I come to these principles, a kind of prefatory remark. You know, when we use the word governance, what are we talking about when we are talking about governance? I mean, this is a particular sort of term of art, and I think the tension within this term, if you ask somebody in civil society, they would say something like, oh, we have a governance problem. Translation, government is not doing its job, right? If you ask somebody in government what governance meant, and the Prime Minister himself says on occasion, you know, we have a governance problem, what they meant was something like, civil society is not letting us do our job. India is a very hard country to govern, right? I think what they are capturing, and this is, I think, the first point I want to begin with when thinking about the challenge of governance, is the fact that governance is not something that is located in government, nor is it something that's located entirely in society. It is something that is located at the intersection of government and society and the way in which these two entities interact, the assumptions they make about each other. And I would like to submit to you that part of what we are struggling at the moment in India, right, is that the balance of government and society is changing in such fundamental ways that government's understanding of what it should do in relation to society and society's understanding of what governments can do is becoming increasingly confused, right? Now, one way of thinking about, I think, both this balance, altering balance of state-society relations, and what's exciting about this contemporary moment is in the following terms. You know, most post-colonial societies, India being no exception, inherited a whole range of institutions from their colonial masters. But fundamentally, there were 6 or 7 principles that underlay that architecture of governance that are now coming apart, that are completely falling apart. So the first principle of the old system of governance was what you might call the principle of vertical accountability, right? The core principle of accountability was you have done your job if you've satisfied somebody above you. In some abstract sense, the ultimate authority is the people who are the highest, right? But the structure of accountability is in a sense very vertical. It was very vertical, right? The second principle of that governance system was relative secrecy. But secrecy also in a deeper sense, that by and large the government, more than society, was, as it were, the producer of knowledge relevant to governance, right? The third principle of governance that we had was by and large what you might call wide discretion. The fourth principle in the Indian context was excessive centralization. The fifth principle was a relatively fixed political economy. So all states have a certain kind of political economy, which is they have to stitch together coalitions of groups that will actually support the state, give it legitimacy, right? Will not revolt against the state. And one of the ways in which states normally do it is by sharing rents, right? Now that political economy was easier to manage when the nature and character of social classes was relatively fixed. Right? And the last and final principle of that old state, I mean, there were many others, but for today's purposes, I'll limit myself to these, was the fact that despite everything, the Indian state was a relatively small state. Right? Small in terms of the marginal impact it actually had on the lives of citizens. Now, what's happening in contemporary India is that all of these principles on which our governance were founded have basically collapsed, right? Vertical accountability is being replaced by horizontal accountability of all kinds, not just within government. And it sounds like a very trivial and banal proposition, but a practice of governance that is attuned towards horizontal accountability is a very different kind of practice of government. How you do a file noting changes. How you present evidence has to change. How you argue for a case has to change. Second, as I said, secrecy is completely gone. Any government that now presumes to govern on the basis of the fact that it has more information than society is setting itself up for a big fall. Okay? Discretion. Now, as I said, discretion cannot be entirely replaced by rules. But what can happen in any society is that the demand for how you justify the use for the exercise of discretionary power can change. Instead of granting government a presumptive right to exercise discretion, or a kind of presumptive trust, that discretionary power will have to be justified to a very wide variety of stakeholders all at once. You have to satisfy them. Centralization. India's, I mean, I've written about this at great length as well, but India simply cannot be governed with the kind of centralized architecture that it still has, right? The rent-seeking arrangement that I talked about, one of the things that growth has done to India is that it has made the management of interests right, in a society at one level both easier and at another level more complicated. It has made it easier in the sense that growth obviously gives the state more revenues to dole out. Unfortunately, it also gives the state more rents to collect and squander, right? But it has made judgments about what the people actually want incredibly more complicated, right? So your class identities, in that sense, now demand a wider portfolio of things that government has to balance and get right. And I think part of the difficulty almost all our politicians are having at this juncture is just it's very hard for them to read signals about what people actually want. And the last and final point, which is kind of collapsed, going back to the point about scale, that the scale of government expenditure now means that the stake that society has in not just monitoring state expenditure, but what a state can do with that expenditure has changed dramatically. Now, the dilemma that we face at the moment is that most of the current political class and current political system is used to thinking about India under old principles of governance. So sure, you will get leaders who will do good governance, quote unquote, for a little bit. You know, some state chief ministers, we say they're doing good governance. If you actually think about it, not really. What they are managing to do is for a short while carve out a space where they are politically insulated and can take certain policy decisions. What they are not being able to do is institutionalize practices of governance that can respond to these challenges. So all I'm saying is that even in cases where you have success, what you have is a success of leadership. What you don't have yet is the success of institutionalization of practices that, as it were, push us towards a new governance paradigm. What happened? What are the 2 or 3 lessons that, in a sense, we can learn? I'll sort of just end with that. Some similarities are really striking. Proliferation of new institutions in civil society, I think India has a lot going for it. And we will need to harness this energy rather than suppress it, because you have absolutely no chance if you try and govern by suppressing civil society. There is incredible mobilization against corruption in Indian society, the exponential growth of a middle class and spread of education. All of these elements suggest that some of the power of civil society to transform the state is heading in the right direction in India. What is missing, and these are just the 4 elements I'll kind of end with, hopefully, the first and most important one was clearly political reform. But political reform in some very elementary sense, the introduction of the primary system and the introduction of some degree of intra-party democracy, the breaking of the stranglehold of small elites within political parties and financing machines, right? The second thing that happened, and this I think is something we tend to forget about American history, is that was a period where a new kind of romance was restored to the American state. Remember, the American narrative was really about there's a laissez-faire state against which the progressives reacted. They said, look, we have to now come build a state. In India, our political narrative is somewhat conflicted. It's somewhat conflicted in the sense that almost all our reform energies came out of a skepticism of the state, right? Because the Indian state had failed, right? Most of our reform energies were taking it out of places where it did not belong, right? But we did not pay enough attention to putting it in places where it does belong. The other 2, which and that's what I'll sort of in a sense end with, is I think the nature of capitalism in India. Capital is hugely important because, let's face it, it's one of the most powerful groups in society, right? The nature of capital's response to a crisis like this is extremely important. The last and final thing, I'll end with sort of my kind of hobby horse, which is, I think you cannot imagine, as Dilip, I think, rightly suggested in his opening remarks, any of this governance revolution succeeding without an underlying revolution towards liberal ideas, right? Because fundamentally, the 7 principles that I outlined, no secrecy, public reason and justification, right? Horizontal accountability, the need to justify yourself to diverse groups. These are fundamentally liberal ideas. They are premised upon a society where the centers of power are dispersed, a very core liberal idea. They are premised upon a society which says that, look, many of the problems that we are facing will not have easy answers. There will be deep differences, right? So as Gandhiji rightly said, I think, and this was the most important truth he grasped about India. He said, our besetting sin is not going to be our differences. We can live with differences of any kind. Our besetting sin is going to be our littleness, right? Which is, do we have the liberal imagination to be able to live in a world with a plurality of agents, trying to govern themselves by public reason? Okay, I'll stop.